Hey guys, so in our last video, we stopped with talking about bone growth. Now we're going to talk about hormonal regulation of that growth. So growth hormone, you've probably heard of human growth hormone, is the most important hormone that stimulates the epiphyseal plate activity from like infancy to childhood. That's when you're growing the most, like the fastest, right? The most growth is occurring there. You also have a thyroid hormone, which is going to modulate the activity of your growth hormone to ensure proper proportions. This means that it's trying to make sure that all of your bones are kind of growing at like an equal rate. That way you don't have like super long, crazy arms and like short legs. Okay. Then we have our sex hormones, like testosterone is going to be present in males and estrogens will be present in females, most prominently during puberty. And they're going to promote the adolescent growth spurts that you'll notice during like middle and high school when you start to grow a lot. And then they're also going to help end the growth by inducing the epiphyseal plate closure, because you know that after puberty you start to stop growing. You don't grow indefinitely forever. Okay. Then we have excesses or deficiencies of any of these hormones are going to cause an abnormal skeletal growth. Okay, that leads to a couple of like different disorders like dwarfism and things like that. It's just that these hormones are not functioning correctly in individuals that have these disorders. Okay, so next we're going to move into bone remodeling. So we talked about how bones grow. Now this is how they're remodeling. So you know that bones are constantly being made and broken down by our osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So actually about 5 to 7% of the bone mass is recycled each week. That's actually quite a bit, right? So our spongy bone is replaced every 3 to 4 years. Remember that that's more on like the internal surface. And then our compact bone is replaced about every 10 years. So pretty much like between these two, I mean, you're getting like a new skeleton like about every 10 years, which is kind of cool. So bone remodeling consists of both bone deposits and resorption. So this is growth and breaking down. So again, we've talked about osteoblasts as being the building cells and osteoclasts as being our cells that help to break down bone. Okay, so our bone deposits and bone resorption, this is going to occur at the surfaces of both the perosteum and endosteum. Remember that the perosteum is on the outside and the endosteum is the inner membrane of our bones. And our remodeling units are just going to be packages of these little adjacent osteoblasts, B for building, and our osteoclasts, C for crushing or breaking down, that are coordinating the remodeling process. That's what bone remodeling is. Think about like remodeling your house. You're going to break it down, but then you're going to build it back up, right? That's kind of what's happening with your bones. Okay, so we'll talk about bone deposit first. So the new bone matrix is deposited by our osteoblasts. Remember our building cells. We have something called the osteoid seam, which is the band of unmineralized bone matrix that marks the area where the new matrix is being laid down. So this is like the difference between like existing bone and like new bone growth. And then we have the calcification front, which is the abrupt transition zone between our osteoid seam and the older mineralized bone. So that is like the actual like visible line, the calcification front of where, you know, you have old meets new. So further on about our bone deposit. So this is the trigger for deposit is not confirmed, but may include these things. So mechanical signals, increased concentrations of calcium and phosphate ions. These things are present in our bones. And we're going to talk about how the concentration of like blood calcium and blood phosphate and bone calcium and phosphate like fluctuate in a little bit for the hydroxy appetite formation. And then our matrix proteins that bind and concentrate the calcium, and possibly also the appropriate amount of enzyme alkaline phosphatase for mineralization. So then about bone resorption. So this is going to be the function of the osteoclasts, because these are like crushing, because remember we're breaking down here. So the blasts build and the osteoclasts are going to crush the bone, break it down. They're going to dig out these little like depressions or grooves as they're actually breaking down the bone matrix or the osteoid matrix. They're also going to secrete lysosomal enzymes and protons, which are represented as H+, that digest the matrix. So this is actually how they're functioning. So by secreting these lysosomal like enzymes, these are like typically hydrolytic enzymes that break things down. And then, of course, acidity converts calcium salts to a soluble form. And then this is important because then that means that it can enter into the blood. And like I said, we'll talk about how we have phosphate and calcium in our bones versus blood and how that's all regulated in just a minute. Okay, so our osteoclasts also phagocytize demineralized matrix and dead osteocytes. So they're just going to phagocytize is like when you surround and engulf materials. So in this case, it's going to be our demineralized matrix and dead osteocytes, so like non-functioning cells. So these digested products are then transcytosed, which means that they're just like traveling through the cell. Is there two L's in that? Probably. Traveling through the cell. So they enter in one side and then they exit the other side of the cell. They literally go through the whole thing. So across the cell, and then they're released into the interstitial fluid and then into the blood. So like I said, this is how we're putting things into the blood. If you're breaking down bone, you're able to take any of the minerals and things in the bone and then release it into a soluble form into our blood. So once resorption is complete, the osteoclasts undergo apoptosis, which is like assisted suicide. So it's like programmed cell death. So once you're done breaking down the bone, you don't need that activity anymore. Then you'll actually go ahead and experience apoptosis in those cells. So then you can switch back over to the building stage. So osteoclast activation involves a hormone called PTH, parathyroid hormone, so PTH, and immune T cell proteins. Okay, so let's talk about how all of this remodeling is being accomplished. What's controlling all of it? So we're talking about hormonal control. We're talking about building and breaking of bones. Okay, so the remodeling occurs continuously, but is regulated by genetic factors and two control loops. So we're going to talk about a negative feedback loop. Okay, so negative feedback loop is when you keep making something until you get a signal to stop, like you have enough of it. So like negative, I think about like a minus sign, it's to like less, right? So you can make something until you don't need it anymore. So the hormonal controls here. So we have a negative feedback loop that's going to control the blood calcium levels, which I was hinting at earlier. So calcium functions in many different processes around your body, such as nerve transmission, muscle contraction, blood coagulation, gland and nerve secretions, as well as cellular division. Okay, so about 99% of the grams of calcium found in our bone or found in our body are in our bones. And then we also have intestinal absorption of our calcium that requires vitamin D, which we learned in our last unit is made in our skin, right? So we have this negative feedback loop that you make the hormone that's going to signal a particular event until that event has reached its apex, like until you've reached enough of whatever cascade event has occurred. And we'll get into this with some pictures and it'll make a lot more sense. Okay, so then the second control of our remodeling is a response to mechanical stresses. Okay, we're just skipping and going back to number 1. That's fine. Okay, so we'll talk about the hormonal controls. So the PTH that we mentioned earlier is produced by our parathyroid gland. Makes sense. It's a parathyroid hormone in response to low blood calcium levels. Okay, so you increase PTH when you have low calcium in blood. So that's when you would increase the amount of PTH. Okay, so it stimulates osteoclasts to resorb the bone. It means break it down. Because we just learned that most of the calcium in your body is in your bones. So if you have a very, very low blood calcium level, if you break down your bones, you're making that calcium soluble to then go back into your bloodstream. So the calcium is released into the blood, which is going to then raise that level, which means that then you would stop, right? PTH secretion stops when homeostatic calcium levels are reached. Okay, so this is why this is called negative feedback. Because you do something, which is to stimulate our osteoclasts, until you reach homeostasis, and then you stop. That's a negative feedback. Okay, positive feedback would just be like you make more and 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 more. Okay, with negative feedback, you make enough until you've reached homeostasis and then you stop. Okay, the next hormone we're going to talk about is called calcitonin. Okay, so it's produced by the parafollicular cells of our thyroid gland in response to high levels of blood calcium. So high levels of our blood calcium. Okay, would we want to be stimulating our osteoclasts again? Probably not, because that's going to increase it even more, right? So the effects are negligible, but when you have enough of it, it can help to lower the blood calcium levels temporarily. Okay, so think about this one here. You're increasing the osteoclast activity, and here you want to do the opposite because you have the opposite scenario. So you'd want to decrease that osteoclast activity, which means that you would be increasing the osteoblast activity. Okay, so here's like a little image of you. Like, okay, homeostasis is the fancy word for balance. Okay, that's why this says, oh, if it's up here, it's imbalanced. Okay, so here you are balanced. So we'll go around in a circle like this. Okay, so we have our stimulus. So falling blood calcium levels, low Ca2 plus in our blood. Okay, where is the calcium? It's in our bones. Okay, so if we have a little bit in our blood, we need to get more of it into our blood. Your thyroid or your parathyroid, okay, is going to be releasing, our parathyroid gland is going to release PTH. If you have an increase of PTH, it's going to lead to osteoclast. It's going to cause them to degrade bone matrix and release calcium into the blood. Because clast, they're breaking down the bone, degrading the bone to release our Ca2 plus into the blood because now it is soluble. So it can go into the blood, and then you stop that signal when you reach balanced again. So that's kind of how that works. Okay, for time's sake, we're actually going to skip these clinical parts, but this is just telling you if you have too much calcium or too little calcium, what can happen into your body. Okay, so continuing hormonal controls here, control of remodeling. So we do have other hormones that are going to play a role in bone density and bone turnover rate. So we've talked about calcitonin, and we've talked about PTH and how they do opposite things in the body. We also have leptin and serotonin. So leptin is a hormone that's released from adipose tissue, which is our fat tissue in the bones that would be present in the yellow marrow. And it's going to play a role in bone density regulation by inhibiting osteoblasts. So bone density regulation by inhibiting osteoblasts. Remember, B for building. So you're not going to overbuild your bones so they are way too dense, and you're not going to underproduce bone tissue to make them not dense enough to support your body weight. Okay, and then we have serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that regulates mood and sleep. It also interferes with osteoblast activity, again, bone building there. Most of our serotonin is actually made, like manufactured in the gut, and it's secreted into the blood after a meal. That's why you get like happy after eating meals. Serotonin is like a feel-good hormone too. And it may inhibit bone turnover after a meal. So bone calcium is locked in when new calcium is flooding into the bloodstream. So when you eat something that contains calcium, it wouldn't make sense for your bones to be broken down to make more calcium to go into your blood if you're already like eating something. So serotonin is actually going to downregulate the osteoblast activity until your blood can kind of figure out what's going on after you digest that food. So that's a really important function there. Okay, so now we're going to get to that teaser number 2. Okay, so response to mechanical stress. So bones reflect stresses that they encounter. So you know that your body is moving all the time. And when you have extra weight on your body, like think about all those textbooks that you carry around, or if you're like a weightlifter, these are different stresses that you're putting on your bone, twisting and bending. Okay, so bones are stressed when weight bears on them or when muscles pull on them. So when you're using your muscles or adding extra weight onto your body, not just in working out circumstances, but just in daily, functions, it causes stress for the bones. So there's something called Wolff's Law that we'll talk about. So it states that bones grow or remodel in response to the demands placed on them, which really makes sense. So bones are going to react based on what you do to them. Well, that makes sense. Okay. So stress is usually off center. So bones tend to bend. So we'll look at a picture of like your femoral head, which is on your femur, and how that's kind of like a curved shape. If it was straight up and down, it wouldn't be as strong. It wouldn't be able to respond to stress the same way as a curved bone would. So we'll look at that in a minute. So stress is usually off-center. The bones tend to bend. So bending compresses on one side and stretches on the other side of the bone. So the diaphysis is the thickest, where the bending stresses are the greatest, which makes sense because you want it to resist breaking. So it would make sense that it's thicker there. The bone can be hollow because compression and tension cancel each other out in the center of the bones. So this is that picture that I was talking about. So bone anatomy and bending stress. So you have this big curve that's happening through here because you have most of the body weight sitting, like this is like this goes into your hip bone, right? And that's like where your leg is attached to your body, right? Near your pelvis. So you have this curvature in our femoral head. So you have tension on one side, they're opposing forces, and you have compression on the other, which leads to a point of no stress, which is why the center of your bones can be more hollow. It also saves on the weight of your skeleton as a whole if you can have spongy bone tissue or hollow long bones. Okay, so more about Wolff's Law. So Wolff's Law also explains that handedness, right or left-handed, results in thicker and stronger bones of the corresponding upper limbs. So you have a dominant side of your body, right? So this is what that's talking about. So the handedness is just on the side of your body that you use more frequently because it has more stress on it. Those bones will typically be thicker. You also have curved bones that are thickest where they're most likely to buckle, which we just kind of looked at. The trabeculae form trusses along lines of stress, which there should be some pictures of in just a few minutes. We have large bony projections that occur where heavy active muscles are attached. So this is really common in people that experience a whole bunch of weight-bearing activities. So someone like a weightlifter, they're going to have really, really, really thick bones where the muscles are actually attached, like the muscles that they're using the most, where the muscles are attached to their bone. They're going to have a really thick area of that bone there where the muscle's attached. And then the bones of a fetus and bedridden people are featureless because they lack the stress on bones of a normal functioning human being, because fetuses don't have stress acting on them, and bedridden people are also not doing weight bearing activities and things like that. Okay, so mechanical stresses cause remodeling by producing electrical signals when the bone is deformed. So compressed and stretched regions are oppositely charged. So this is talking about our electrical signals, so oppositely charged. Compression and tension changes fluid flowing within the canaliculi, which may also stimulate remodeling, which again is just the building and breaking of our bones. So our hormonal controls actually determine whether and when remodeling occurs in response to changing blood calcium levels, but our mechanical stress determines where it occurs. Okay, so hormonal controls whether it's going to happen and when it's going to happen, but mechanical stress determines where, right? Where in the bone is it actually going to happen? So hormonal control says, yes, do it now, or don't do it. Here's where you're going to do it, right? Is actually determined by our mechanical stress. Okay, so we're going to go into bone repair. If we're remodeling our bones all the time, we get a new skeleton every 10 years. Well, what about if something happens to that skeleton, right? We don't just want these fractures in our bodies to exist forever. You do have a little bit of weakness that's there typically. You'll notice it maybe for the rest of your life, but we do have fracturings and breaks that happen, and then we also repair those. That's part of the remodeling system as well. So in bone repair, that means that you've experienced a fracture or a break. So during youth, most fractures result from trauma. So, little kids are kind of reckless, and they kind of ignorance is bliss. They just run around and do kind of crazy things. So you have a lot of fractures from trauma. And then in old age, most result from weakness of bone due to bone thinning. It is not fun getting old, right? So this is more like wild abandonness, right? And then over here you have your weakness from being old and brittle. Life's tough, okay? There's different classifications for how you can actually classify, for lack of a better word, the fractures. So there's 3 either or fracture classifications. So the position of the bone ends after the fracture. So position of the bone ends after the fracture. So this is going to be where the bone is actually, the ends of the bone are located after that break occurs. So if it's non-displaced, it means that the ends retain their normal position. So there's not that much displacement happening. If it's displaced, the ends are out of the normal alignment, which is obviously worse, right? You have the completeness of the break. So if it's complete, it's all the way through. Makes sense, complete. Okay, and then incomplete would be not broken all the way through. And then whether the skin is penetrated, these are the bad ones, right? If it is open or compound, the skin has been penetrated. So your bone is coming out of your skin, right? If it is closed, it is considered simple and the skin is not penetrated. So you cannot see the white of your bone because your skin is still intact, okay? You can also describe your fractures based on the location and the external appearance and the nature of the break. Okay, so I'm going to let you read these just because they're tables directly out of your textbook, just again for time's sake, and also because you should have read the chapter hopefully first, right? Okay, awesome. Okay, so we're going to talk about how you would treat a fracture and how that's going to be repaired. So we just talked about the classification of these fractures, but what's the treatment? So the treatment involves reduction, which is the realignment of the broken bone ends. So you have closed reduction, which is when the physician is going to actually like manipulate it into the correct position. And then open reduction is when you actually need surgical pins or wires to secure it. So like that's going to be like a worse kind of fracture because you need to have extra things put into your body to make sure that your bones don't snap back to where they just broke. Okay. Then you also have immobilization as a treatment or by like a cast, like you've seen your friend like break their wrist or something and they have a cast, or traction, which is bad when you have to use like the bedridden people that have like the pulley systems and everything to like keep their arms elevated or their leg up in the air. Like that's when you have all the wires and pulleys and you're in these crazy positions in like a hospital bed. Okay, those two, cast and traction, are needed for healing. You need time is needed for the repair, depending on the severity of the break, the bone that you broke, and then of course the age of the patient, because kids are a lot more resilient than old people because, when you're old, your bones become more brittle and it's just not a good time. Okay, so repair involves 4 major stages here. So you have a hematoma formation, you have a fibrocartilaginous callus formation, you have bony callus formation, and then you have bone remodeling, which we've been talking about this entire time. Okay, so hematoma formation is when we have torn blood vessels that actually hemorrhage and they're forming a mass of clotted blood. That's called a hematoma. So it's a bump, it's swollen, it's painful, it's inflamed. Here's kind of what that would look like. So the stages of healing a bone, this is number 1, a hematoma formation. So the hematoma, you have a broken blood vessel that has leaked clotted blood into the surrounding area and it has caused the skin to swell, right? And they are painful. Okay, next we have the fibrocartilaginous callus formation. So the capillaries are going to grow into a hematoma. You have phagocytic cells that are going to help to clear away all of the debris. So phagocytic just means that they phagocytize, which means that they're going to wrap around and engulf these debris. Okay, then you have our fibroblasts that are going to secrete collagen fibers to span the break and connect the broken ends together to start mending. You have fibroblasts, cartilage, and osteogenic cells that begin to restructure the bone because it's broken. So now we're trying to restructure it. So you create a cartilage matrix of repair tissue. Osteoblasts are going to form the spongy bone within the matrix. Remember, osteoblast, B for building. Okay, and then the mass of the repair tissues is called the fibrocartilaginous callus. So this is what that looks like here. So now you can see it's not just blood that's present in this like sideways eye shape, right? Now you have like, this is the quote callus that's formed. You have new blood vessels, you have spongy bone starting to form. So that's what the second step here of healing a bone looks like. Okay, our third step is a bony callus formation. So within 1 week, new trabeculae appear on the fibrocartilaginous callus. So this is one more step. Okay, and so the callus is converted into a bony or hard callus of spongy bone, and the bone callus formation continues for about 2 months until a firm union of the two sides exists. So this is what that one looks like. So you can see that you're starting to form all that spongy bone in the middle here. So this lasts for, like it says, about 2 months. So that's why it takes so long to heal our bones, because it's just kind of like a slow growing process. So that is step number 3 of 4. And then lastly, we have our bone remodeling. So this is what we've been talking about the whole time. So this bone remodeling is going to begin during bony callus formation and continue for several months after. So even on top of all of the bone callus formation, it's going to be an extended amount of time. You have excess material on the diaphysis exterior and within the medullary cavity that's going to be removed. Our compact bone is laid down to reconstruct the staph walls, because remember, that's like what's on the outside and what's on the very inside. It's like a sandwich. And then our final structure is going to be resemble the initial structure, right? So that's a good thing. You're trying to repair, not just create something brand new. So your bone will, have the same weight-bearing capabilities that it once had. Okay, so this is what it looks like in stage 4 after bone remodeling has occurred. So you have a healed fracture. So here again is the 4 stages all put together. So you have a hematoma. So this is when we're dealing with blood clotting that has escaped from the area. You have the fibrocartilaginous callus formation, when you have a bunch of cartilage starting to form and a little bit of spongy bone tissue starting to come into play. Then here you have the bony callus, which is now a harder callus that has formed. And finally, bone remodeling has repaired our bone in the last step. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some bone disorders. So we hinted at this earlier with like hormonal control, like when you kind of get some of that like out of whack, that it can lead to bone disorders. So we have imbalances between the bone deposit and bone resorption that underlie nearly every disease that affects the human skeleton. So the 3 major bone diseases that we'll talk about are osteomalacia or malacia and rickets, and we have osteoporosis and Paget's disease. Okay, so osteomalacia or rickets. This is when we have bones that are poorly mineralized. So they're not going to be as strong as our mineralized bones. The osteoids produce, but calcium salts are not adequately deposited, which results in soft and weak bones. Okay, so pain upon bearing weight, which just kind of walking around can even cause pain. With rickets specifically, this is more common, like it's osteomalacia of children. This is going to result in bowed legs. And other bone deformities because bone ends are enlarged and abnormally long, right? So this is just a disorder of the skeleton, and it's caused because of a vitamin D deficiency or insufficient dietary calcium. Okay, remember that you can pull calcium from your bones, but you also need to incorporate it into your diet in order to have strong and healthy bones. Next is osteoporosis. So osteoporosis is a group of diseases in which bone resorption exceeds the deposit. Okay, so you're breaking down more than what you're actually building. So the matrix remains normal, but bone mass declines. Okay, so the spongy bone of spine and neck of the femur are the most susceptible to these. So the vertebral and hip fractures are very common with people that have osteoporosis. And this is an image of what that looks like. So you have like a normal bone up here, and then down here you have osteoporosis. Think about like pores, porosis. It's going to have more pores in it. Okay, so the architecture is very different between a normal bone and an osteoporotic bone. Okay, so these are some risk factors for people with osteoporosis. Okay, so most often aged postmenopausal women, so like older women is where it's most common. It affects about 30% of women between the ages of 60 and 70 years and 70% by the age of 40. 70% of women by the age of 80 will have osteoporosis. Like, that's kind of crazy. 30% of Caucasian women will fracture bones because of osteoporosis, and estrogen is a huge contributing factor to this. So estrogen plays a role in bone density, which we learned in hormonal control of bone growth. And then so when the levels of estrogen drop after menopause, because your body is not actually in the reproductive phase of life anymore, women run a higher risk of getting osteoporosis. Men can still get it, but they're less prone due to the protection by the effects of testosterone, which they'll continue to make forever, pretty much. So this is their sex hormone that's going to help to increase, like bone remodeling and everything. Whereas with women, it will start to slow down because your estrogen levels drop off, especially after menopause. So there's some additional risks with osteoporosis. So let's talk about those. So petite body form, so just being small in the first place. Insufficient exercise to bones, stress bones. So if you don't ever exercise, your bones aren't going underneath that like mechanical stress to make sure that they're growing more where they need to. So then if you just never exercise or put that extra stress on those bones, they're not going to form to actually support you in all of your activities. Poor diet and calcium and protein. So remember, again, calcium you can pull from your bones, but pulling too much from your bones is bad for you. So you need to incorporate calcium into your diet. That's why you might hear as like, especially like a growing kid, like drink your milk because you're going to get calcium, which is good for your bones, which is true. And then of course, protein. Smoking can actually increase your risk of getting osteoporosis. You also have hormone-related conditions because we learned how our hormones affect our bone growth a whole lot. So hyperthyroidism can be a contributing factor to osteoporosis, as well as low blood levels of thyroid-stimulating hormone and diabetes. Okay, also immobility. This kind of goes to what I was saying up here. If you're not mobile, your bones are not going to have that mechanical stress put on them to thicken where they need it to become stronger. And then males with prostate cancer taking androgen suppressing drugs. So these affect your hormone levels, which again will affect how your bones grow and remodel. So what are the treatments for osteoporosis? So there's traditional treatments like calcium. Okay, you can take supplements or you can increase it in your diet naturally. Vitamin D supplements if you're not getting enough secreted by your body being outside. Weight-bearing exercise. I've been talking about that because that's how the mechanical stress helps to remodel your bones to make them stronger where they need to be. And then hormone replacement therapy, because we also talked about the hormonal control of bone remodeling and bone growth. Okay, so hormone replacement therapy can slow bone loss, but it doesn't reverse it, right? And it's controversial because of the increased risk of heart attack, stroke, and breast cancer. And remember that osteoporosis is present in most present in older women, older people in general, right? So if you're going to start doing hormone replacement therapy and older people, it's already, they're already at risk for a whole bunch of other ailments in their lives, but then you're also increasing the risk of heart attack, stroke, and breast cancer. There are drugs to help treat osteoporosis. You have bisphosphonates that decrease the osteoclast activity. Remember, osteoclasts are the things that break down bone. So if you lower their activity, then hopefully you won't have so many pores forming in your bones. It partially reverses osteoporosis in the spine. You also have selective estrogen receptor modulators, which mimic estrogen, but it's actually not estrogen, so you're not putting the patient at risk for those other risk factors we just talked about without targeting the breast and uterus. And then denosumab is another one, and this one deals with antibodies. So monoclonal antibodies shown to reduce fractures in men with prostate cancer. This is because of those other drugs that they're on for prostate cancer. Okay, this kind of helps to counteract that. It's an antibody that's supposed to help reduce the risk of fractures and increases the likelihood that your bone remodeling will occur correctly and improves bone density in the elderly in general. So how can you prevent osteoporosis? So plenty of calcium, like I've been saying, okay, and then in your diet in early adulthood, reduce the consumption of carbonated beverages and alcohol because these actually leach minerals from the bone and decrease bone density. Right? So that's a problem that's going to lead to osteoporosis. So if you drink a whole lot of sodas or pop or whatever you call it in your region, but we say soda down here, okay, it's going to leach minerals out of your bones. Okay, and the important ones again are our calcium and then our phosphate as well, right? Those are the big ones. Okay, plenty of weight-bearing exercise. So there's that, in the fitness community, the argument of whether cardio or weight-bearing activities are beneficial. And it's been proven that weight-bearing exercises are beneficial over time, not only because in the long run, they will end up burning more calories, so that will lead to greater fat loss, but also because weight-bearing exercise helps to increase bone mass above normal. So that's like a buffer against age-related bone loss. So if you're constantly lifting weights and you have bone remodeling because of that mechanical stress, your bones are already thicker. So then as you get older, if you have bone loss that's going to naturally occur, your bones are already thicker to begin with, which gives you a better chance of avoiding osteoporosis. Okay, then we're talking about Paget's disease. So this is excessive or haphazard bone deposit and resorption causes the bone to be made fast and poorly. Okay, so this is called a Pagetic bone. So it's a very high ratio of spongy to compact bone and reduced mineralization, which is not going to be a strong bone. Okay, it usually occurs in the spine, the pelvis, the spine, the pelvis, the femur, and the skull. And it rarely occurs before age 40. So again, it's like older people that keep getting hit with all these crazy things. Like it's hard enough being old as it is, but then your bones are just like, nope, we're not going to work anymore. Okay, so the cause is actually possibly viral. It's not really something that's been nailed down that we can like, oh, yep, this is the cause, right? But it's possibly a virus, probably like one of the lysogenic viruses that like stay with you forever. The treatment includes calcitonin and bisphosphonates. So calcitonin helps to decrease the osteoclast activity, which remember osteoclasts are going to break down your bones. So that's what calcitonin tones down bone breakage, right? So you're not going to be breaking down as much of the bone. Okay, so we'll talk about the developmental aspects of the bone, and then we are out of this chapter. So embryonic skeleton ossifies periodically. So fetal age is easily determined from x-rays or sonograms. That's kind of how they're able to tell you like, oh, how far along do you think you are? Oh, I think I'm only 4 weeks. And be like, nope, you're actually 7. I can tell that because of the ossification of your fetus, right? And then most long bones begin ossifying by 8 weeks, with primary ossification centers developed by week 12. Okay, so the development of bones from birth to young adulthood. At birth, most long bones are ossified except for the epiphyses, which are going to be the ends, right? The epiphyseal plates persist through childhood and adolescence, and then somewhere around age 25, it's different based on your gender and your hormones that you have just in your particular body. All bones are completely ossified, and skeletal growth ceases, so you stop growing. So here's a picture of a fetus. This is the fetal primary ossification centers at 12 weeks. So you can see the little like fragmented bones that are forming with cartilage in between all of them. Age-related changes in our bones. So in children and adolescents, bone formation exceeds resorption. So you're growing a lot faster. That's basically what that means. So males tend to have greater masses than females because their bones are just growing. Bone formation is just happening a lot faster than the resorption part of the remodeling. In young adults, they're pretty balanced between males and females. And then in adults, bone resorption exceeds the formation. And then bone density changes over your lifetime are largely determined by your genetics, as a lot of things in your life are determined by your genetics. So the gene for vitamin D's cellular docking determines mass early in life and osteoporosis risks at older age. So your genetics can actually lead you to be predisposed to developing osteoporosis. And then bone mass, mineralization, and healing ability decreases with age. Again, decreases with age. Old people just have it tough. Okay, beginning in the fourth decade. So the exceptions are going to be except the bones of the skull. Those are still going to be intact, and they still mineralize, and the mass is still there. Bone loss is greater in whites and in females. So these were the risks that we talked about earlier, 30% of Caucasian women, and then 70% of females after the age of 80 are going to develop some sort of bone disease, typically osteoporosis. Okay, so we made it. That's the end of chapter 6. The next 2 chapters of our textbook are also about bones, more specifically the type of each bone, the structure of each bone, what they do, where they go. So we're going to be studying the actual skeleton and where all the pieces fit together in our next 2 chapters, and we'll talk about joints then as well. Thanks for sticking with me, and have a great day.